Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the committee's 25th meeting in 2019. I'm sorry for the slightly late start, which was due to a technical issue. Could I ask members and those present, please to make sure your mobile phones are on silent. The first agenda item is the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018, and we have received a consent notification accompanying correspondence in relation to one UK SI as detailed on the agenda. Given that the Scottish Government has already consented to the instrument being made, the committee can only now consider it retrospectively and whether it is content that consent was given. We might want to respond to the Scottish Government to this effect or any other alternative action. The committee may also wish to ask the Scottish Government about the new UK replacement for the traces system as suggested in the paper. Before I invite comments on this, and I believe there may be a couple, I would like to say that as this is a matter relating to agriculture, I would like to refer members to my register of interest in that I am a member of an agricultural partnership, which they should also remember for the second item on the agenda. Peter, you wanted to say something?
Likewise, I need to declare that I am a member of a farming partnership in the northeast of Scotland.
Okay. Thank you. So, are there any comments from committee members only? Stuart.
Thank you. I have a registered agriculture holding of minuscule size. It's 4 acres. I just wanted to make one comment, and I'll preface it by saying I'm supporting what's being done here, so I have no issues at the end of the day. It's the right thing to do. And I'm not criticising the way either government at ministerial level has dealt with it. But I do note in Marie Goujon's letter to us on the 20, I can't quite read the date, in August anyway, that she, at that point, it is being said, please note we have yet to have sight of the final SI and it's not available in the public domain at this stage. And I think it's a pretty uncomfortable place to be, that while the officials of the two governments are working together and seeing drafts of the instrument and are saying to the Minister it's going to be okay, the Minister found herself in the position of having to make comment about an instrument she was unable to see and therefore guarantee. And I just wanted to put on the record, I think, that that's a pretty uncomfortable place for everyone to be in, although everybody's intentions are good-hearted and are trying to do the right thing. And I just wanted to note that I don't recommend to you or to the committee that leads to our taking any particular action. I just regard it as sufficient to put that on the record.
Thank you, Stuart. Jamie, you wanted to say something?
Thank you, Convener. Very briefly, just to add on record further comments to a conversation we perhaps had before we went into public session, and that's that in general it's not satisfactory protocol that the committee is asked to note something for which consent has already been given. However, I do also note the extraordinary circumstances in which this instrument was presented to us and to the Scottish Government, and I appreciate the correspondence between the two governments on that matter. Given that there may be further instruments of this nature before the 31st of October, I wonder if the committee could stress upon all parties that it is preferential that the committee is given adequate notice to review such instruments in advance of ministerial authorisation or approval being given, not after.
Thank you, Jamie. Does any other committee member? So I think the point that Stuart Stevenson has made is duly noted on the record, and I think it would be right for the committee to say that we would appreciate seeing these instruments before the consent is given, but understand there may be circumstances that aren't. But on the basis of those two facts, is the committee agreed to write to the Scottish Government to confirm its content that consent has been given? Agreed. Okay, we are agreed. Therefore, I'd like to move on to agenda item 2, and that's the implication of Brexit on the agriculture sector. Today we'll be taking evidence on the implication of Brexit for agriculture on a range of interested as organisations and individuals. As this is a round table discussion, it's the first of two, the second one will be on fishing. I'd like to do things slightly different to the way we normally do, and that is for individuals to introduce themselves as we go around the table. So I would start by saying I'm Edward Mountain, and I'm a regional MSP for the Highlands and Islands.
Archie Gibson. I am the Executive Director of Agrico UK Limited. It is a wholly owned, is a subsidiary of a Dutch-owned cooperative, and we specialise in the introduction of seed potatoes, the introduction of new potato varieties and multiplying seed potatoes based near Forfar. I was one of Fergus Ewing's agricultural champions specialising in food and drink, and I was also on the National Council of Rural Advisors. Thank you.
Maureen Watt, MSP for Aberdeen South and North Kincardine.
Eleanor Kay, Agriculture and Forestry Policy Advisor for Scottish Land and Estates.
Angus MacDonald, MSP for Falkirk East.
David Michie, Deputy Director, Soil Association Scotland.
Colin Smith, MSP for South Scotland.
Jamie Green, MSP for the West Scotland region.
James Withers, I'm Chief Executive of Scotland Food and Drink. We're the industry development body tasked with growing the food and drink sector in Scotland, and we're a membership body too. We've got about 460 companies and organisations across the food and drink sector that are members of ours as well.
Stuart Stevenson, MSP, Banffshire and Buchan Coast.
Richard Lyle, MSP, Uddingston and Belsill.
Stephen Thompson, Scotland's Rural College, and I also act as a KE lead for communities and business for the strategic research programme through Safari Gateway.
John Finney, MSP, Highlands and Islands.
I'm Johnny Hall. I'm Director of Policy with NFU Scotland.
Emma Harper, I'm an MSP for South Scotland region.
Carmen Hubbard, Newcastle University.
Mike Rumbles, I'm one of the MSPs for the North East of Scotland.
Sarah Miller, I'm Head of Industry Development at Quality Meat Scotland, the Red Meat Levy organisation in Scotland. So our strategy is to help deliver a sustainable, professional, resilient and most importantly profitable red meat industry to contribute to 30 billion by 2030 target set by Scotland Food and Drink. We are a non-departmental public body, so we are restricted in what we can talk about with policy, but we can identify in detail challenges and recognise solutions to help meet those.
Peter Chapman, MSP for the North East region.
Thank you. So the way this is going to work is there are various themes which will be introduced by committee members, and if you'd like to come in on the themes, try and catch my eye. And once you caught my eye and I bring you in, don't worry about pushing any buttons on the speakers. That will all happen remotely, as it were. I have said in the past that when you're speaking, don't then look away so you can't catch my eye again, because the only way then for me to catch your eye is to signal vigorously with my pen that you're coming to the end of your time, because I want to get everyone in, because it's really important that everyone gets a chance to speak. So please look at me, and I'll try then to bring the next person in. And I'd also ask you to keep your contributions as focused as possible. It just means that, you know, we have about 2 hours to go through this. It just means that everyone then gets a chance to contribute. So, having said that, I'm going to ask Emma Harper to lead on the first theme. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I won't have a big long preamble. So, basically, I'm interested in what the Cabinet Secretary stated on the 16th of May, Cabinet Secretary for Rural Economy. He said there would have been severe disruption to our supply chains, the imposition of punitive tariffs, the loss of markets and the introduction of complex and costly non-tariff barriers, including the requirement for export health certificates. So I'm interested from the panel, how involved are you and your organisations in Scottish and UK government's preparations for Brexit?
Okay, of course, the danger is if all the people around the table then look away, that I will just nominate somebody, and I guess the chance will be somebody who's not ready. But Johnny Hall's first in, indicating he wants to go. Johnny.
Could I, first of all, just clarify that we're talking about Fergus Ewing's comments in relation to a no-deal outcome, I assume, what the implications then might be for Scottish agriculture. I think we would share some of the significant concerns around a no-deal, and that no-deal situation remains probably more of a probability than a possibility than it has done in the past. But if you look back at the no-deal preparations that were undertaken by the UK government back in February in particular, as we approached the 29th of March deadline, various pieces of work were put in place in terms of tariff schedules and so-called preparedness. None of those filled us with confidence at all. It would have provided or afforded some protection for obviously more vulnerable sectors, particularly the sheep meat sector. But what we would describe as the asymmetric approach to those tariffs would have also exposed other sections of Scottish agriculture. Our biggest concern about no deal is that nothing has changed. As we passed the 29th of March, then we passed the 12th of April, and now we're facing the 31st of October and setting aside all the politics. The threat of the no deal remains absolutely clear, and we're very clear in our view or our assertion that a no deal crash out of the EU would be highly damaging. I think the UK government often referred to as a bumpy road, but I think it would be highly damaging to certain sections of Scottish agriculture. And that threat in itself continues to undermine confidence in the industry.
Thank you, Johnny. James, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, thank you. And I would echo Johnny's comments. And I suppose my interest here is in, a strong, resilient agriculture sector, which is the foundation of much of our £15 billion food and drink sector. We've been heavily involved in Brexit preparations, groups both led by government at UK and Scottish Government level. I would echo the Cabinet Secretary's concerns. I think the industry is resilient, adaptable and talented enough to navigate its way through a Brexit deal, whatever form that might take. A no deal, however, could have a disastrous impact, particularly on our sheep sector. My own view is it would have the same economic impact as a foot and mouth outbreak in 2001 in terms of our main export markets closing. There's a lot of planning work going on. We're particularly challenged that it turns out there is something worse than a no deal at the end of March, and that's a no deal at the end of October. So if you're asking companies to stockpile ingredients, we just can't do it. It's heading up for the Christmas build-up. There are seasonality issues in relation to the sheep sector as well. So an end of October no deal is even worse than the scenario back at the start of March. And I think, I would be keen to state that we cannot plan our way out of the impacts of a no-deal Brexit. We can mitigate some of them, but I would flag export health certificates as one example where, we issue about 15,000 of those export health certificates a year across Scotland. In a no-deal scenario, we will suddenly need them for trade with the European Union. And frankly, in a deal scenario, we will probably need them for trade in the European Union, with estimates that the number of certificates needing to be issued could be over 100,000. The current system can't cope. I don't believe the system can cope. It will fall down on the 1st of November if we require export health certificates, meaning that even if we can get through disruption at ports, the ability to actually get products like seafood and, crucially, animal derived products onto the continent will be massively compromised. The impact of that, I think, could send some manufacturers, some smaller ones, under.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to bring Stephen Thompson in, followed by Stuart Stevenson. So, Stephen.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pick up on Johnny's point there about the protection that the DEFRA and Treasury tariff schedule, whether it gives support or not to the sheep meat sector, and I would say it probably doesn't because of the tariff rate quota that we already have. So it's significant, and New Zealand aren't meeting their or aren't fulfilling their quota at the moment. The schedule, the tariffs that have been implemented literally don't matter for the sheep meat sector just now, because that tariff rate quota, if it's utilised, will continue to see the flow of sheep meat into the sector. And on the tariffs, I think it's important that we acknowledge the DEFRA and Treasury had an incredibly challenging role to play in terms of making sure there's not significant consumer price inflation, at the same time as trying to make sure that vulnerable sectors are supported. And I think that's why the beef schedule, particularly in the the 230,000 tonnes of tariff rate quota will enable the beef sector or red meat beef to come into the country to make sure there's not significant consumer price inflation on that one. I think the dairy farmers that could have had support haven't been given that in the tariff schedule because we're a huge net importer of dairy products. And we have to acknowledge as well, and it's interesting that we always focus on agriculture, is that there's a significant knock-on effect into the wider rural economy in all of this in terms of agri-supply chains. And some of the work that we've been doing in the strategic research programme actually shows just how linked the rural economy is to the land-based sector. So we have to remember this. It goes way beyond agriculture.
Stuart, you wanted to come in briefly, and then I'm going to go to Archie Gibson.
Yes, it's a very narrow supplementary based on what James Withers has just said in relation to export health certificates. And I understand that's one of 6 pieces of paper that will now be required for food exports as compared to 1 at the moment. And in particular, I just wonder if colleagues round the table who've joined us today have, as I have, talked to Aberdeenshire Council, because it's Trading Standards who issue these certificates, and they've told me that they feel they simply won't have the resources to give the speedy response that the industry, particularly where live exports of sea fish and so on are concerned, they don't have the resources to do it. And I just wondered if the other councils around Scotland are in a similar position. And in no way am I criticising Aberdeenshire Council for this. I think it's just the facts as it's been explained to me.
Okay, maybe we'll get a chance to come back. Maybe I'm going to go to Archie, and then Sarah Miller wants to come in, and there are 1 or 2 other people, so we'll see if the answer comes out there, Stuart, if we may. Archie.
Thank you, Mr. Guda. Try and answer the question. I'll focus in on plant health aspects for a moment. I appreciate that the animal health, export health certificate issue is extremely pressing. However, for the Scottish seed potato industry, for example, 100,000 tonnes of potatoes are exported annually to different countries, most particularly to Egypt. At the moment, there has been some work done by SASA in conjunction with FERA with the Egyptian authorities to get what they call publish an order. Now, the order would indicate that the Egyptians are willing to take Scottish seed this season, post the end of October. But as James alluded, the October deadline is really challenging because most exports go out before Christmas and into the early part of the new year. As it stands, unless we have a transition arrangement, then there will be no clear mechanism for seeds to be exported to countries where the deal has been negotiated by the EU, but affects us as an individual member state. SASA do take the lead within the UK piece when it comes to plant health passports and phytosanitary regulations, but they have to do it through the appropriate channels of DEFRA. I have written to SASA and to Scottish Government policy people asking what exactly will the label look like. For example, just to give you a little tiny detail, but the label, the plant passport label on each and every consignment of seed leaving the UK has a big E and a big C, quite clearly. It's EC under EC regulations, which are harmonised, which the UK regulations are harmonised with. But the concern is that if an official has not been properly briefed, whether it's on the Canary Islands as per Spanish jurisdiction or in Morocco or in Egypt, and that official says, well, UK can't export with EC because they're no longer a member if we have a no deal or no transition, then the danger is the stuff perishes on the quay. This could be very, very damaging to the Scottish industry and to our reputation. So it's an area of concern which I think the committee would want to be aware of.
Thank you. Sarah, you wanted to say something, and then we're going to come to Carmen Hubbard.
Yes, I just wanted to reiterate Johnny and James Withers' comments about the danger of no deal to the Scottish livestock sector, in particular to the sheep sector, but there are also concerns for beef and the pig sector as well. The sheep sector in particular, we're in the middle of our prime sale season just now. There couldn't really have been a worse time to have a no deal, as James has alluded to. But more importantly as well, this is a time where the TUPs would be going out for the next year's mating season, so for next year's crop of lambs. So any decision or indecision now will not just impact on farm finances this year, but could go on for many years to come as well. So it's long-term implications as well as the short-term implications of no deal. As an organisation, we obviously take no deal very, very seriously. Been involved with both Scottish and UK governments, resilience group planning, etc. But we need that information coming through so we can reiterate that back to the farming community and to our wider footprint as well.
Okay, thank you. Carmen, do you want to?
Just quick, probably just to add a little. I was exactly in the same on the same wave as Sarah. I think when we talk about implication, we need to make differences between the short term and the medium and long term, because they will be very different. It's true that uncertainty doesn't allow us to really to come out with what exactly will really happen. It was indeed about the no deal, but I think even in the case of an agreement with the European Union, there will still be some transaction cost at the border. So we can't actually, even if it's, even if we don't have, we will get a deal. Even if we get a free trade deal, this means that there will not be the same as we would have been before, just trading freely. And I agree absolutely with you, Archie, in terms of labeling, which I think this will be a very short-term implication, which will actually have an impact an immediate impact.
Thank you for that. Peter Chapman wants to come in, but before he does, can I just say I'm going to then go back to Johnny Hall, who's probably itching to answer Stuart Stevenson's question on documents, because somebody's going to have to. And then I'll come back to Emma to see if there's a follow-up question before we move on to the next theme. And Johnny, yes, you will have to answer it. Peter. Well, you are now, Peter.
It was just a follow-up to what Archie said about the seed dye situation. Obviously, we recognise how serious the paperwork and the labelling situation is. I just wonder if have you any feeling, any idea that is likely to be sorted by the end of October? I mean, what negotiations are going on, and how well down the road are you to sort this issue out?
Briefly.
Thank you, Commissioner. I have, as I mentioned, I didn't complete the story. I wrote to SASA, wrote to Scottish Government policy people, and I've had a verbal indication back from someone whom I know and trust at SASA. There are two labels have been produced, one with UK and one with Britain on it, GB on it. Apparently the GB one is the favoured one they will use, but only when they know whether we've got a transition, in which case it'll be probably carry on as EC, or a no deal, in which case it'll move to GB. But in terms of so the draft labels have been designed. They will be printed by SASA and presumably sanctioned by DEFRA. But until unless we get that in writing, we do not know that actually the promulgation of that change would be communicated via the EU to individual representatives.
Okay, Johnny.
It's just to sort of extend the discussion a wee bit away from tariffs and certification issues and things like that. But obviously, UK government and Scottish government are involved in discussions around mitigation measures for particular sectors. And again, I go back to the sheep meat sector in terms of offering a temporary form of assistance to that sector, which again would be very significant to the interests of the Scottish sheep sector. And it's just to highlight that that's not a straightforward issue either, because whilst financial assistance may be found from UK government across the UK, I think it's going to be very, very important that that's done in the right way that protects Scotland's interests, because there are two avenues of approach, really. You could introduce something called a variable premium, which would essentially prop up the market, or you could introduce something like a U premium, which would be a direct support to the primary producer. And my real concern about that is that you end up with a differentiated approach across the UK, which then might have a distorting effect on the internal UK market as well. So the position gets more and more complicated.
Emma, do you want to come in? Because I know James and Jamie want to come in, but maybe if you've got a question, James will be able to help with that.
Yes, Just really, I mean, there's obviously a lot of uncertainty and insecurity and people are worried. And in the summer, though, we heard that 75% of farmers had not done any preparation for a no deal. And so how resilient is the Scottish food industry, and what else needs to happen in order to support the rural businesses, the rural economy going forward?
I'm going to bring in a couple of people, and then because there are quite a lot of other themes, I'd like to probably move on. So, James, if you'd like to come in, and then I'll bring in Eleanor because she hasn't had a chance yet. James.
So I was just going to offer a brief answer to Stuart's question, as I understand it. A disproportionate amount of the certification burden falls on a small number of local authorities, and it's not proportionate to the amount of food and drink trade that is done within that particular region. It's about the shape of the businesses. So whether you are exporting a 5-kilogram box or a 5-ton container, both require that document and form. So for Argyll and Bute, Highland and Shetland, by memory, who will account for about 40% of all the certificates issued, in areas where you have comparatively smaller businesses, the burden of certification is much greater. The sheer number they have to issue is huge. So there is a disproportionate burden that falls onto a small number of local authorities. And the challenge is we can't just throw money at the problem. Even if you ring-fenced £1 million to hire, you know, X number of EHOs, my understanding is they're just not there to be hired. And one quick comment I'd make just on Emma's point about how resilient is the sector. Not resilient enough. I honestly don't know if you were a sheep farmer asking that question, Emma. I honestly don't know what I say to you and how you prepare for no deal. I think longer term, the absolute trick for Scotland is to be selling a broader range of products to a broader range of markets. We sell 2/3 of all our food exports to Europe. That's why Brexit is quite so scary. Now, that's improving. Only 5 years ago, it was 80%. So the value of trade with Europe is increasing, but our overall reliance is dropping because we're selling faster elsewhere. But we need to have a broader range of markets. But that takes years. It's happening, and there's great investment happening from government and industry into those markets elsewhere, in North America, Middle East and Far East, but it takes years to build up that spread of markets. And the whisky industry have done it, but it's taken them a century.
Eleanor.
Thank you. I think we know that the industry can adapt when they're sort of thrown challenging situations, but we also know from the extreme weather payments that we've needed to have that we can't adapt as quickly as we need to. We're not as resilient as we should be. And perhaps the argument is, as the majority of producers don't export, they don't have that direct market, that there's a disconnect. We're not quite sure what we should be doing. We should probably be doing something, but there isn't this incentive or perhaps immediate need to change our practice. But we know we should be doing something, which is possibly why 75% haven't made any changes. They know they need to make changes, they're just not sure what. I think to do that, though, we need knowledge, we need better understanding of the market at a primary producer level. But we also need investment to be able to mitigate and to be able to accept or make the most of the new markets that we have. But it will be a change of policy, and that's a discussion that we need to start having now.
Thank you. Now, just as I thought we were getting to the logical place to move on, a whole lot more hands would come out. So, David, I'm going to bring you in because you haven't had a chance to speak, and then I'm going to bring Sarah in very briefly, and I will bring Stephen in very briefly, and then we're going to move on to the next subject. So, David.
I'm just going to talk about the implications of no deal on UK organically certified produce. So in the case of a no deal, the UK will be a third country and organic certification will not be recognised in the EU. So the control bodies in the UK have submitted applications for recognition to the EU to be recognised, but this is a political rather than a legal position, so there's absolutely no idea of timescale and when that decision will be made. So there have been some trade deals, according to DEFRA, there are some trade deals with Australia, Canada, Israel, New Zealand and the USA, but we understand that some of these are temporary in nature and some cannot be confirmed or come into effect immediately. So in other words, no deal would be pretty catastrophic for organic certification in the UK.
Thank you. Sarah, briefly.
Just on that resilience piece that Eleanor was talking about, over the last 3.5 years at QMS, we've been running the Monitor Farms Scotland programme. We've got 9 monitor farms across the the country, from Shetland down to the borders and into Dumfries and Galloway. And actually some of the work that's been coming out there has shown we've had over 6,000 farmers engaged in that programme over the years, over the 3.5 years, that have been looking at how they can make their business more resilient. But as Eleanor said, we need more knowledge exchange, and I think having those programmes to help enable farmers to take them on the journey that inevitably everyone's going to have to go on as we transition to a new trading arrangement, to a new policy arrangement, that this uncertainty is almost not going to go away. And a big part of that is going to be the wraparound support to take farmers with us to the new world we see ourselves in.
Okay, and Stephen, briefly.
Yeah, just very briefly, some of the research that we've been doing for the Scottish Government has shown that quite a lot of the farmers indeed aren't prepared or actually think that Brexit will have significant impacts upon their businesses. Now, this isn't unique to farming because we've been doing rural business surveys as well, and we're finding pretty much an identical pattern between the wider rural business base and the farming base with regards to whether they think Brexit will have negative consequences or positive consequences for their business. Younger businesses and younger farmers tend to believe that the disruption that Brexit will create market opportunities, whereas the older businesses are the ones that are most negative towards Brexit, probably because they don't want to have to make changes to their business in their elder years. So there's an awful lot of uncertainty, and to be fair, if I was farming just now, I would be uncertain as well, because you're making decisions based on pulling numbers out of thin air, because there is no real direction. There are things that people can do so that they are prepared under different scenarios. So if X, Y, and Z happen, they know what's coming, so they can make changes to their business. But we know that businesses aren't investing just now because it's a very uncertain period that they're in.
Thank you, Stephen. John Finney, you wanted to come in.
Thank you very much, Convener. Yes, no, I'm enjoying the input so far, Convener, and a lot of reference has been made to sector, but also significant reference has been made to farming. I wonder, could I ask our participants to have some regard in their responses to the crofting communities, because I think there are a number of unique features there that are worthy of commentary. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I think that's an important point to carry through as we go through the rest of the discussion. I know there are people around this table who now feel aggrieved that I'm not bringing them in on this theme. I apologise. I'm trying to manage a process to get everyone in with a chance. So I'm now going to turn to Angus MacDonald and say, Angus, could you introduce the second theme, please?
Okay, thanks, Convener, and good morning again to the panel. If I could look at the issue of challenges with regard to the workforce. Now, we're all clearly well aware that our agricultural sector relies heavily on seasonal non-UK workers, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe, to meet the labour demand. And we also know from a recent SPICE briefing that even prior to the 2016 referendum on exiting the EU, the veterinary profession, to take one example, was already facing challenges in recruiting and retaining staff. And clearly Brexit has the potential to add further uncertainty for EU nationals with the associated impact in Scotland. So I'd like the panel to give the committee a sense of the impact that uncertainty around Brexit is having on the workforce in the agri-food sector, to start with.
Who'd like to kick off with that? Stephen.
Yeah, again, just some of the work that we did for Scottish Government last year was on seasonal migrant workers, and we've kind of followed it up this year to see just a follow-up survey just to see what's happening. And when you get words like business critical coming back in the feedback, then that's quite worrying. So the story we're getting is that the workers came this year. It was more challenging to get them. People were having to use recruitment agencies more. The big challenge they've got is nobody is certain whether these workers are coming back next year. So if the workforce, normally the workforce, about 60–70% of them in terms of seasonal workers will come back year on year. This year, they're getting no indication that these workers are coming back. So there's a huge risk to them in terms of business planning for next year and the year after. And then we tend to forget the other sectors of agriculture, like dairy sector, which are using more permanent workers from the EU. And again, that's a worry. Will they continue to come? Will they come in cycles, 5-year, 6-year cycles perhaps? And there's feedback again that there are issues there. And then you've got haulage sector, you've got the red meat processing sector. It is quite a scary fact that we are heavily reliant on this EU workforce, and making sure we've got continued access to it is vital.
Stephen, just before we move on to Archie once again next, I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying. Could you just quantify how much of that may be down to, or if any is down to the value of the pound? I mean, is there less wages being achieved than before, you know, because the pound is less, so when they take it home, it's not worth so much? Is that an issue?
Yes, that's a reported issue. So in a Spice blog I did for the Parliament last year, I developed that argument where they've taken basically a 25% cut in the last 3 years. But if you go back further, it's not so different than 6 or 7 years ago. But those workers that have been here 3 years ago, 4 years ago, they definitely have seen a big hit. The other thing that we've got is very low unemployment levels in Romania and Bulgaria, where a lot of these seasonal workers are sourced from. And even youth unemployment has fallen considerably there. So there's a whole host of factors, particularly that they're moving into areas like Germany, Sweden, which are maybe closer to home, less uncertainty in those markets.
Thank you, Stephen, and I did read the Spice briefing that you prepared. So, Archie.
Thank you, Kavita. I was invited by the House of Commons Scottish Affairs Select Committee to give evidence on migrant labour earlier in the summer. I did this in conjunction with James Porter of Angus Soft Fruits, and certainly from the potato sector and the soft fruit sector, they are mutually supportive. Obviously, fruit season happens before the potato season, and the people used to go from one to the other. There are 2 agencies being set up. They are actually both based in the south of England to deliver this £30,000 salary cap, 2,500 places. The overwhelming evidence from everybody contributing to this subject was that that's completely inadequate. There's an estimate of around 87,000 seasonal arable agricultural workers required in order to bring crops in across the whole country. In the soft fruits industry alone, it was in Scotland, in Angus, it's around 14,000 people. And those people naturally flowed into the potato harvest and other activity like storage and grading throughout the winter months. It worked for the migrants, it worked for the businesses. If those people, as Steve has identified, simply don't come because improving economic activity in their home countries, improving opportunities and the devaluation of sterling, then it is going to be very, very challenging. I should just say at this stage that actually only in some sectors, and not, frankly, soft fruit or potatoes, are there robotic or technological solutions at this time. So it's not simply a question of investing, perhaps with some support, which the unsupported sector would welcome, in getting a machine to do it for you. There are mechanically harvested blackcurrants for Ribena, for industrial customers. That's a slightly different thing, but hand-picked fruit, it's got to be hand-picked.
Okay. I'm going to bring in Johnny Hall and then Jamie Green. Johnny.
Yeah, it's just to essentially echo the points that Stephen and Archie have just made, in that, you know, we've always taken the view that the immigration issue, the people issue around Brexit is hugely challenging for Scottish agriculture. But we've got to be very careful about how we cut it. It's not simply a matter of seasonal availability. It's not just about numbers. It is about, as already been identified, it's about seasonal and permanent. It's about on-farm and off-farm in the processing sectors, in the haulage and all the distribution networks. And it's also about these issues around skilled and what we would say competent. And that then introduces Archie's point about the seasonal agricultural workers scheme pilot, which is being run, and the salary thresholds in there being totally inappropriate to the agricultural sector in particular, and indeed the numbers which have been used. So that we've made lots of representation to the Home Office and the Migration Advisory Committee, the MAC, to say that this needs to be reviewed. There is further consultation going ahead with this, but there still remains significant shortfalls in what will be required in order for Scottish agriculture to function effectively. And when I say Scottish agriculture, I embrace the whole food and drink sector in that. And I also endorse what Stephen said about the economic prospects in the rest of the EU. So I think this is not talking about EU labour anymore. This is about talking about non-UK, because I think we will definitely, as the UK, as Scotland, we will have to broaden our horizons to non-EU, further afield, Ukrainian workforce and so on. But we need a mobile and able labour force to effectively harness what we do in Scotland.
Thank you. Jamie, you wanted to question?
Yes, thank you, Convener. It's a very interesting subject. I mean, I do wonder, and I question our guests, is there are certain things which are obviously government can control in terms of its visa structures, but clearly there are certain things that it can't, and we've talked about the currency fluctuations, which have the potential to devalue the take-home revenue opportunities, but also the economic situation in the countries where we're currently recruiting. And is it the case that as countries that are closer to home become more economically advanced and develop, we're seeking workforce from further away? You're now talking about Turkey or Ukraine, and then when that market is doing well, are we then looking further to Southeast Asia or other parts of World or Africa? And my question is really is that even if the visa system was perfect, which clearly many people think it is not at the moment, is that a long-term solution to the issue of how we resource these manual jobs, and what is industry itself doing and planning for the future to ensure that we have people to pick the fruits and do the work that we need to do, that's not simply relying on this type of migrant model?
Now, there are people queuing up to come in, so I'm going to go to Sarah. And Carmen, I noticed you were nodding there, so I'm going to bring you in relatively shortly. But Sarah, if you'd like to go.
Yes, just a couple of themes that have came out there. One issue we have in the red meat sector is an abattoir staff that's already been highlighted. At the moment, we have plants that are running under capacity due to the lack of workforce. This is a serious issue that's hitting now, and is not one that is to come. It's impacting now, and I suppose as we look at the implications further down the chain, if plants aren't operating at capacity, that means there can occasionally be bottlenecks and waiting lists, which then mean that livestock that are ready to be slaughtered have to wait, which then means they can go out of specification, and the end product is the high quality product isn't as good as it could be. So there's real implications on this that don't just end in the processing sector. And again, as both Stephen and Johnny and others have said, the 30k limit on the threshold there, it's irrelevant to our abattoir staff, and that's something that's a real challenge for that sector. On some of the other themes, particularly in Jamie's question there about what our business is doing. So we have, as I said, a challenge in the processing sector, but on farm as well. It's been recognised for a long time that we have fewer younger people coming through. So we at QMS, alongside others who are in this room, have been looking at how we can work with the next generation, going into schools, going into universities and colleges, and highlighting what career opportunities are available, not just within farming, but within that wider food and drink supply chain. And trying to look at some of the different skill sets that can be applied to show it as what the vibrant, flourishing part of the economy that it is. So there's a real piece there, and in terms of attracting our own into the sector, but as well on the ground there are significant challenges that already exist as well.
Carmen, just before I bring it in, I mean, one sees quite a lot in the press about the difficulties of finding full-time labour to work on farms, especially within livestock industries. A lot of people are happy to drive tractors and work crops, but are not prepared for the exceptional hard work that livestock production is, and finding full-time labour. So maybe that could be borne in mind. Carmen, and then I'm going to come to Emma, and then I'm going to go to Eleanor. So we'll see if that works. Come on.
I agree with everything which have been said, and I think we have to make that difference between unskilled and skilled, and you already, Emma, and others pointed out the importance of the skilled and permanent labour in the food processing, in the abattoir. So we talk about vets, which actually they're all coming from the other countries. So across the supply chain, if these people will disappear, so probably in the short and long term, we will all probably will face some implication. I think I might have said this to the committee before. At Newcastle, we have I have done. I run a project in which we look at the implication of Brexit using different trade scenarios. The report is done and it's quite long. I have 150 pages. Nobody will read, but you know the executive summary is there. And looking at the figures, so we actually what we did, we model free trade agreement with EU, WTO, and unilateral trade liberalization. Unfortunately, we could not really model the implication of the labour at such. However, we did some sensitivity analysis and we came with some figures. And if assuming that if the unskilled, so I talk only the unskilled labour force in the post-Brexit period, I mean we modeled between 2017 and 2026, if the unskilled labour force will be reduced, for example, by 10%, we estimate about a reduction in the UK agriculture output about 3%, and if the unskilled labour force will be reduced by 30%, the UK agriculture output will decline by between 11 and 12%. So these are quite important figures reflecting the dependence, if you like, of the agriculture sector and the food supply on the labour coming from outside. Giving, you know, what will happen in the future, not relying really on immigrants, probably that might be a little bit tricky. We don't have really now the answer. However, we might want to think that UK population, in particular population in Scotland, is actually aging. So that might be a problem in the future. So how that will actually be sorted out, you know, with our own people, that's a different question, because we will actually, you know, we talk about aging population in the UK, particularly in Scotland.
Thanks very much. Emma, you wanted to come in just
just a quick supplementary to maybe for Stephen, that it's highlighting dairy workers, and so they are not seasonal, and I've raised this in chamber as well. I'm just wondering if there's any research or info about specifically how many EU citizens are working on our dairy farms. 48% of Scotland's dairy farms are in the southwest, and they're here with their partners working in care homes and in the care sector, and their wains are in our rural primary schools. So it's everything about a no deal would mean immediate stopping of movement, of free movement of people. So do we have specific numbers of how many people are we talking about?
Stephen, you could answer that very briefly, and if you don't want to, I'm happy to go to Eleanor, and then I'm going to come back to Angus for a follow-up. Do you want to answer it briefly?
I can answer that. The reality is that we don't know. So we don't know on permanent numbers. And anecdotally, when we were doing the survey work, I was getting some evidence from some dairy farmers in the southwest saying that they've got 14 workers, 15 workers, all from the EU that are potentially looking to relocate, depending on the outcome of Brexit. So we don't know.
Okay. Eleanor, you're next, and then I'm going to come to Angus. Back to you.
Thanks. No, I was going to sort of echo Johnny and Sarah's points as well, but also add that the issue isn't just necessarily in agriculture in terms of dairy and the wider supply chain. There's also an issue with forestry, and as we keep pushing more forestry on farms, we're really struggling with forestry workers too. As well as the knock-on effect of if it's families coming over, there's the service industry and the tourism, which is so ingrained in the rural sector too. And it's not just one sector; it is all of us. And that essentially we need to have a system or an approach that attracts the best and shows that we have skills and knowledge and experience, and that it is worth coming to Scotland for that. And it's also agricultural research, finding the right academics as well. It's so far-reaching, but we need to be pulling in this pool of resource from the whole world, not just the European Union.
Okay. Thank you. Angus.
Okay, thanks. Convener, just briefly, is it possible for the panel to give us a sense of how the makeup of the workforce itself has changed since the referendum in 2016? For example, are we seeing a higher percentage of UK nationals filling the posts, or are these jobs remaining unfilled?
So, James, would you like to start on that, and then I'll go to Stephen, and then I'll come to Archie.
So I think there's been a change in sentiment that I've seen rather than necessarily the reality of the makeup of the workforce. So I think there's been less interest in coming to UK Scotland because of uncertainty, and also the message about immigration, which drove the Brexit debate. I think the factors which are the devaluation of the pound and the upturn in economies in Eastern Europe have been key, as well as the potential on what the future visa system might be, how the EU settlement scheme has changed, and even just the alteration of that scheme just in its short lifetime and the uncertainty that has caused. So I don't think there's been a huge change in the actual structural shape of the sector. And I think there isn't much scope for that because of the relatively high levels of employment we have in Scotland, and the low levels of population growth we have in some of the areas that this industry is most prominent, the more peripheral areas and fragile areas of rural Scotland. Just while I'm speaking, just one thing I wanted to add, which I think is a really important point, is that we often talk about non-UK EU workforce in the context of picking fruit and supposedly low-skill areas. What I would say is right across the food and drink industry, and particularly in our agri-businesses are involved in processing, those individuals are involved right through the businesses. They're running teams, they're around the boardroom table, some of them are managing significant operations now. So they have, some have come in at, I suppose, entry-level jobs, others have been recruited into more senior roles. So it's an issue right through the supply chain. It's not a kind of gap we have in the night shift on the factory floor and reluctantly we need to go to Poland to hire. It's integral to the whole structure of the employment structure in Scotland.
Okay, Stephen.
Yeah, just reiterating that point there, that some of the work that we've just done is showing that of the permanent workforce, the vast majority is EU in these fruit and veg or horticultural operations, and they are agribusiness. We are talking about very, very large operations, and if you look at the output of the horticulture and potato sector, it is a very big sector, and it's controlled by very few businesses in essence. So we're talking about agribusiness. Coming back to Jamie's point, I think that's a very valid point. Is that the model is that we have to keep going further and further afield in order to get the workers. This isn't unique to GB or Scotland. This is happening in America. It's happened in Australia. It's happened in other countries, and we keep pushing further and further afield. Now that's got its own dynamics in that where you have multiple workforces from multiple places. You need all the health and safety notifications, everything. The language barriers suddenly become an issue. Culturally, we hear that when there was all these different groups working in the 2000s to 2005 period, it led to some interesting dynamics on farm. So these are issues that at some stage we have to overcome them, and perhaps at some stage we have to realise that consumers have to pay more in order to allow us to pay more to the workforce. And all of the workers are at least on minimum wage, and some of them are earning quite a lot of these, a lot in terms of their piece rate enables them to earn £16–17 an hour. So it's an interesting dynamic that we've got.
Okay, Archie.
Thank you. Red light, not quite. I'll speak up. Just wanted to make a comment about something that Eleanor touched on, and that's surrounding the, if you like, the academic support to our sector, the rural economy in broadest sense, and not least agriculture. And I'd say we're actually very blessed in Scotland. We have James Hutton, we have SIUC, we have Rowett, we have Morden, obviously, with the livestock side of things, and along under the Safari banner, which Steve is very much involved with, is a hugely important asset. And I would urge the committee to recognise that in its broadest terms and ensure that funding for those organisations actually is kept going. The second point I'd like to just observe is Angus's comment about are we doing a better job at bringing in long-term UK residents, Scots, local people to get involved in our industry? And I think the answer is business should be trying, it needs to try, it needs to work harder to sell the merits on the benefits of an employment in the rural economy to local people. I think there's still more work to be done on that. But there's no doubts that we are very dependent and will be for a long time to come on people coming in from outside. There are huge issues with that. Steve touched on them. Jamie mentioned, alluded to it in his question, and we have to make these people feel welcome, and we have to provide them with housing, a living wage, not a minimum wage, and training, etc., etc. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I have unfortunately not been able to get round everyone who wanted to come in, but we're going to move on to theme 3, and Stuart's going to lead on that. Stuart.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. It's worth saying some of the things I would talk about here we've already developed, so I'll try and narrow it down a bit. I mean, Eleanor and Archie have talked about academics, Sarah and Carmen have talked about abattoirs, and Stephen talked about standards, health and safety standards. But in particular, perhaps we might look at the narrower focus that touches on all this, what we'll do about replacing the European Food Standard Agency, access to the European Union Reference Laboratory for GM food and feed, and the European Network of GMO Laboratories, and the whole access to European EU reference laboratories. I'm just going to dump the whole of what I might cover in one go, and just the whole implications that has for standards of food and feed in the country, and perhaps one very small thing that hasn't been covered in relation to abattoirs, which I understand is a problem with the huge number of foreign vets there are in abattoirs. I'm being told that they need to recertify, and that process appears to be considerably behind any meaningful timetable to help whether that can answer. Now, that's the whole thing, Convener, so hopefully we can make focused and rapid progress to get on to other themes.
I don't know, you seem to have swamped them, Stuart. There's no hands up and everyone's looking in a different direction. So I said that was dangerous when you did that. James, off you go.
Yeah, thank you, I think. Yeah, I have no idea on the first question. Really how we replace that kind of expertise and structure that exists in Europe. What I would say is obviously we have Food Standards Agency in England, Wales, and Food Standards Scotland. If we are going to trade with Europe, which will be essential, you know, there will be no unpicking, and there should be no unpicking of food quality standards, food safety standards. We will need to meet European levels of food production, environmental protection, animal welfare, etc. There's going to have to be a completely new relationship with the likes of EFSA and others as a third country, in the same way China would if it wanted to work with Europe. So we'll need to maintain those levels of structures. And I have to say, from a brand Scotland point of view, we should be continually striving to increase the protection that is around our food and farming industry. On the vets and abattoirs, I think that's probably well covered. I know Sarah had referenced that earlier on in her particular comments. I think it will be important as we go into wider trade deals that we don't look at those trade deals to lower standards that we have already, and we don't invite America into our market by allowing standards of food to come in that we would not allow to be produced in our own country. And it's important generally that we don't take this opportunity to unpick a regulatory framework that, whilst to some extent industry is never a fan of regulation and will frequently around this table complaining at levels of regulation, the reality is it underpins our brand. We don't want to gold plate, but we want to maintain those world-class levels of protection.
Okay, Johnny.
I'll start off by entirely 100% endorsing what James has just said. Any erosion or dilution of our standards, we are shooting ourselves in both feet, big style. We are not a stack it high, sell it low, commodity-driven agricultural economy. Far from it. We must maintain our integrity throughout everything we do, environmental, animal health and welfare, and so on. That's obviously very much in this sort of external, outward-facing issues around trade deals and who we deal with, the future EU relationship and others. I think there's also, though, I think this is very important from a Scottish perspective about how we deal with those things internally inside the UK market. It's still a concern of ours about how we get to the point where we have commonly agreed regulatory frameworks and how they are governed across the United Kingdom, so that you do not have significantly different variation in approach across devolved administrations, which then potentially has an impact on all sorts of aspects of agriculture and food within the UK. As things currently stand, we are governed by the EU regulations, and they are then transposed into UK and Scots law, etc., etc. If we start to see any sort of wiggle room between that, which is applied in the rest of the UK, say, compared to the UK, then I think we're in a very dangerous territory about, protecting the integrity of the internal UK market. And we already know that there are tensions in terms of policy perspectives between the different devolved administrations. I'll throw GM into the mix on that particular issue. And therefore, how does that square? How do we govern our environmental standards? How do we govern our animal health and welfare standards across the UK? We hate the Commission for all the regulatory reasons that James has identified, but they do act as judge, jury and executioner in many ways, and therefore we know the game that we have to play. If we end up starting to play with a slightly uneven playing field, or even a different set of rules, then I think we're in for a bit of a bumpy ride.
Thank you, Johnny. Carmen, you want to come in?
Just to add to what James is saying, in terms of standards and regulation, I do not think that we will actually end up reducing standards and quality standards. How would that happen? Would they say to farmers, okay, now you produce whatever you want, when you already have, they have their own system, their own way of acting, we have our own welfare code. So I don't see that really happened in terms, we actually producing less quality products. But the other point I want to add to you is that we are, in terms of standards, probably we are doing very well, and I would like to think that most of the EU laws and regulations that were already probably imported in the UK laws and regulation, most of them, they were actually, this is my understanding, that somehow they were transposed, probably 90% or so within the UK regulation. But the other point is, if we deal with other countries, we will have to respect the standards and the regulation of that countries. So China, they have very, very different regulation in terms of their imports, from the EU and the UK. So we will have. Everybody will face actually some challenges, because we will have to respect the regulation and the standards of each of the country we are actually dealing with, and that will actually complicate, in my opinion, a lot this issue.
Sorry, can I just clarify that? But your comment.
I was coherent. Yeah.
Yeah. No. But your comment is you don't believe farmers will want to drop standards for what they're doing at the moment. They'll want to keep the standards up. Stuart, sorry.
Yes.
Just wanted perhaps to nudge other contributors. I'm not just asking about standards, I'm asking about the infrastructure that helps us develop and support them, where at present much of that infrastructure lies in the EC, and clearly we'll need to have our own shared across the UK, as Johnny properly indicates, and I just wonder if that might be something that others will address.
So I'm going to bring in Archie, and then I'm going to bring in Eleanor.
Stuart, thank you. Try and answer your question specifically about infrastructure. I'll give you an example of the Plant Health Centre of Expertise, which is chaired by James Hutton. It's relatively young. It was formed 18 months ago. This organisation, which brings in expertise from across the country, so there are retained experts from Warwickshire University, Leicester University, and so on, and it covers everything on all plant health side of things. And interestingly, I think it helps underwrite the protected status that Scotland has within the European Union and recognised globally around high health in terms of soil. And I think it goes to the heart of what James was talking about and what Johnny alluded to and Stephen would comment on around looking after our national asset, which is, you know, our land. We are a verdant country. We grow some great grass. We've got animals that can thrive on it. And we've got farmers with expertise who are not going to compromise, exactly as Carmen suggests, I would imagine, around standards. So I'm more optimistic about that. And I would say that the Plant Health Centre of Expertise needs to become long-term established part of our infrastructure, along with the Safari organisations, because it has the ability to do some horizon scanning, whether it's on oak processionary moth, birch borer beetle, or any myriad of blights and funguses and bacteria that otherwise compromise what we do in Scotland. We have a limited palette of what we can grow and rear, and we've got to protect what we've got because there is demand for it out there, both in established markets and in potentially new markets. Thank you.
Okay. Eleanor.
Thank you. I just sort of wanted to go back to the internal common frameworks point. We completely agree that we need this common framework to exist to prevent internal market distortion. We're slightly concerned that we've had very little detail following the publication of the principles that we had sort of early last year on what these common framework discussions would involve. And it's important to highlight that flexibility is often the watchword when we come to common framework discussion, but they can exist within common frameworks. The Common Ag Policy is a common framework. And we know there are many ways that it can be interpreted and delivered, but this overarching policy would give us a degree of consistency, but also allow us to tailor policy for our domestic situation. So there's a lot we can do within a framework.
Okay, thank you. And it appears, Sarah, you're going to have the last word on this theme. So, Sarah.
Just on this, Quality Meat Scotland have pioneered farm assurance in the world in many cases. And when we say food standards and would not slip, in some ways they already have, not on the livestock side, but just to give a working example on the arable sector, with the ban on neonics, which is a chemical to protect oilseed rapeseed, particularly from cabbage stem flea beetle. So the impact on farm is that in many parts of the UK that oilseed rape is now not a viable crop to grow. Yet we can still import oilseed rape that has been grown using neonics, which is competing with our own farmers. So that's one example that already exists that I think is useful to highlight to this committee. And if you use that example in other areas, it's that implication of bringing in food or products that are grown to a lower standard and not enabling and supporting our own. That's when things get dangerous, I think.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to theme 4, and Peter's going to kick us off on that. Carmen, I apologise. I know you wanted to come in. You may get a chance on this one.
Thank you, Convener, and welcome to the panel. My question is surrounding supply chains, and we've already discussed quite a bit about supply chains as far as exporting is concerned. So I would like to focus a bit more on the internal market. You know, we've already heard that there is a dichotomy among farmers, and younger farmers actually see opportunities within Brexit. So let's look a wee bit positive on the thing. And we do know that the best market for Scottish agriculture and Scottish food and drink is the rest of the UK. We have a huge home market which we don't fill. We only supply about 60% of what we eat in this country. So there is a huge market there, and the rest of and we are importers of everything, basically, apart from sheep meat. So how well prepared is the Scottish industry for a rise in demand for home-produced products? Let's focus in on some of the positives here. There is a huge home market which we don't fulfil. Can we see a way to grow our industry and focus more on what we eat in our own country?
Oh, difficult question. Who would... Again, you're all looking away from me. Try and help me, somebody. James.
So, I mean, aside from the Brexit negativity that I think my colleagues around the industry have shared in the room, you know, I completely bought into a long-term opportunity for farming, fish, food and drink in Scotland. Long-term, absolutely bought into that. And I think that there's huge opportunity, both home market and overseas. What I would say is the home market dominates, absolutely dominates some key sectors in our industry. 90% of beef, roughly, I think, Sarah, will be sold in the UK. 75% of our sheep meat is sold in the UK. 90% of our dairy products are sold in the UK. So the UK dominates the profile of a lot of the agricultural sectors represented around this table. And the strongest, most resilient sectors I have seen in our sector, and I would point to whisky and I would point probably to our salmon industry at the moment, are those that have the good spread of markets overseas as well as home. And we have a massive imbalance in home market versus overseas on dairy, red meat in particular. That's not to say there aren't more opportunities, and more opportunities right within Scotland in terms of food tourism is a growing demand, and we can do way better in Scotland at showcasing our own products on our own doorstep to our own population and those that are visiting. But it cannot be an either or, and if anything, I would say up until the last 10 years, it has been all about home market, not about exports. And the fear of the cliff edge of our biggest export market closing is significant. And the reality is there is no domestic home for 25% of our sheep meat that if we can't sell it into the European Union. We could build that over time, Peter. I believe there is more demand we could build, but it takes time. And it certainly can't be done in the next 40 days or even if the Brexit deadline moves to the end of January. So I wouldn't dispute there are home market opportunities, but we're already hugely reliant on the home market in what is an incredibly competitive retail environment as well.
What you say about sheep meat, and I said that in my question, sheep meat apart, and we know that's a difficult problem. Sheep meat apart, we're net importers of virtually everything else. So there is an opportunity for our industry to focus more on supplying our home market, which at the end of the day is our best and most profitable market right now, I would argue, anyway.
Yeah, I would agree, but I'm not, and I think there is some import substitution, but we shouldn't aspire to some parts of that. So if we take our dairy sector, a value cheddar line that Tesco or retailer will sell is probably coming in from Ireland, and they're probably selling it for, I don't know, £1,800, £2,000 a tonne. I'm not sure that's my aspiration for the right product line for Scotland. We need to go premium and higher value than that. Countries that can do mass volume and cheaper should go for some of those opportunities in the UK. I don't believe that there should always be the opportunity for Scotland. Again, it's not to say I don't disagree there are home market opportunities, but some of the market opportunities being filled by our competitors elsewhere, I don't necessarily aspire to from Scotland because I don't think we can compete on price, and I don't think we should aspire to compete on price.
Johnny, I'm going to bring you in, and then Stephen.
I'm just going to follow up on James's very last comment there, that I agree with. I don't think we can compete on price, and that's why Peter's point about the internal market relates to the previous point about standards, because I think what we've got to bear in mind is standards that to which we operate come at a cost. And therefore, if we do open ourselves up as a market to all sorts of free trade deals which allow us to suck in imports of all sorts of things of a lower standard and therefore of a lower price, then I think we just simply export our responsibilities. And that's something that I think we need to be very, very careful of. But I do agree with Peter in the sense that, Scotland's market is, by and large, if we're being glib about it, is probably the M25 and inside it. Given the disposable income and the populations that are there. And I think we need to take those opportunities, but I would reiterate what James has said, is that, let's go for the premium based on provenance, and let's sell ourselves as high quality with the story behind our food of how we produce things. And that goes back to the standards issue. So I don't think we can separate these two things out at all. And that's why I think it's very, very important that we get this whole governance of standards. So it's absolutely clear that what the consumer buys as a Scotch product, and this incorporates labelling issues and all sorts of things, they know exactly what they're getting and they are prepared to pay the price for it, whether it's strawberries and raspberries from Angus or whether it's beef from Galloway or wherever it might be.
Okay, I'm going to come to Stephen, then I'm going to bring Emma in.
Yeah, I just want to endorse what both Johnny and James have said there. The comparative advantage or disadvantage our farmers have. We have got a huge area of unproductive land, challenging farmland. You know, we've got a very good beef sector in Orkney. It's very peripheral. They've got additional transport costs. All of these mean that we are struggling to compete on prices. If you look at world beef prices, people say, well, we're not that far different from Australia or America or Argentina. We're not that different, but they all take most of their profit from that price, whereas we're reliant on support payments often for that profit. So we have to be really careful about how we position this. The other thing that we have to remember, Peter, is that the fifth quarter, the carcass balancing. Carcass balancing is such an important aspect of any of this. For those of you who don't know that, in Britain we tend to be a bit fussy about what we eat. So we eat lots of legs of lambs. We don't eat the other parts of lamb often. So they get exported. We import lots of legs of lamb. So the carcass balancing is vital. We heard at the Beef Summit the processors saying how the fact that the fifth quarter and the hides, there's reduced world demand for those things just now is affecting their profitability. We live in a world of integrated global supply chains in terms of agri-food products. And it will go back to, it won't just be in the output side of things, it's also in inputs. And we have to remember that quite a lot of the inputs into the agriculture sector actually are imported, which means then the exchange rate effects have significant effects too. So I think sometimes we need to look at import substitution and how we farm and do things differently. It's not always just about the output, it's about how we farm and do utilise the inputs more effectively.
Okay, briefly going to bring in Emma and then I'm going to go to Eleanor.
It's just to pick up on the point on standards and promoting the provenance, because you might need to correct me, but I'm aware that in America the acceptable white cell count in milk products is higher, which is an indication of treatment of mastitis, which is painful when you milk cows with mastitis, and that means antibiotics. So the acceptable levels of white cells in the produce in America is higher than it is in this country. So that affects the provenance of, if you're comparing the cell count levels, where if we're going to be bringing in milk produce on free trade agreements with the United States, for instance. Is that a concern?
It's a very specific question that on a very specific issue, and I want to sort of broaden it out, but if somebody wants to come back very briefly on that, I'm happy to do it. If not, I'm sorry, Emma, it is quite specific.
I know it is, and it doesn't have to be answered today.
Carmen, I'll bring you in on that.
Yeah, I was just when it comes to trade and standards, which they are related, for example, to animal welfare under the WTO, we will not be able to argue with even if you make a trade agreement with the US, we will not be able to say no, we can't bring this, because it's no evidence that will harm us or the animals. It does, mastitis is very bad for the cows. However, it doesn't affect the end product. So we will not be able, from a standard point of view, which we are not able scientifically to prove that will harm us, to stop any imports which will come from this country. We can't even stop under the chlorine, Chlorine is actually the chicken chlorinated in America. That's related to the health of the the fact that they do it because they try to stop salmonella. However, that is not an animal issue. It's not an animal welfare issue, and we cannot really stop saying, no, this is not really right, if we do not actually prove that will harm us. So that's my that's my understanding when it comes to standards, which you have no scientific evidence to prove that they will harm the animal or us.
I mean, wanted to avoid the issue of chlorine-treated chicken because it seems to be misunderstood, I would say, and I don't really want to get involved in that. But I'd like to go to Eleanor, and then I'm going to come to Archie. And Carmen, you had indicated earlier you want to speak, but I think you may have got your chance now. So, Eleanor.
Okay. No, I think it all kind of boils back down to this point of, is it high-value commodity production or premium high quality? And I think it's quite clear from looking at the industry that our sort of potential or the biggest returns are from our premium high quality production. It's the provenance, it's improving the consumer understanding of where this food comes from, of the quality that exists because it is Scottish produced. And it's also looking at the environmental aspect, the fact that this land is managed. It means it's the land that you come to Scotland to see because of the agricultural production. There's a lot that we could do, though, to improve or increase our production without necessarily moving towards commodity. It is looking at productivity and efficiency, it's supply chain integration, it's biopower, it's cooperatives. There's a lot that we can do to generally improve the business baseline of agriculture, but it will require investment and knowledge exchange and a policy change, because we won't have that protection of the Common Ag policy. We won't have basic payment level, or we will, but it might not be for the same thing. And it's getting the industry ready for a changing market, whether that's a domestic market or international. It will need businesses to change, and it's entirely possible, but it won't be immediate.
Okay, Jamie, you wanted to come in briefly on that.
Yeah, can I just ask, we're obviously talking about very different industries here, dairy, beef, sheep, salmon markets, etc. Can I ask if anyone has any insight into what those markets are doing to improve domestic uptake of products that would reduce reliance on, and indeed perhaps go into behavioural changes? And I'll give you an example. I was in the supermarket last night and there were three options of fruit in front of me. It was a Scottish sourced one, one from the south of England and one from overseas. The one from overseas was the cheapest, one from England was the mid-priced, and the Scottish one was the most expensive. Of course I bought the Scottish product to support industry, but consumers are faced with that choice, and I do wonder if as a result of everything that's going on, we may be able to shift consumer behaviour to support our local markets more. And indeed, as others have pointed out, that may include paying farmers a fair price for things.
I think Johnny might be able to pick up on that. I'd like to bring Archie in, then I'm going to come to Peter and maybe give one or two others then to answer that in a more global question at the end. So, Archie.
Thank you. Yeah. Peter, just to touch on the supply chain side of it and the bit that's possibly not been mentioned so far, and I echo what everybody's said so far, is transport. So transport, there is this notion within the UK internal market that if you're not central, you're cost plus, so you're not competitive. So I would say for your part of the world, for the whole of the Murray Coast, Black Isle, every crofting community, we're up against it in transport costs every time, which is why things like abattoirs being local and reducing, helping welfare and all the rest of it, whether it's mobile, whether it's supported in some way, should be as local as possible. Because it's easier, and I would suggest more economically sustainable, to add value to a product that's travelling, having been through that elementary primary process piece, than it is when you're trying to live transport. So I would observe that about livestock, and of course Hawley is a very specialist in this area. They need to be for welfare reasons and other things. If you take agri-produce, veg in general, moving vegetables generally requires a refrigerated truck. If you're exporting them, you need a refrigerated reefer. We've got some limited plug-in points at Grangemouth and at Airdrie, and that's to be welcomed. There's been some work done on that, but I would say it's not enough. Accessing containers for Scottish primary produce producers is tricky. You have to book them. Quite often there can be other world events going on, and these containers just are not available. And the worst case scenario is you're then using what they describe as a dry box, which means that the probability is the product can go off while it's in transit. And this has been the experience of many over the years. In terms of import substitution, I think there really are opportunities here, but again, it comes back to my point I made earlier on about there's a limited suite of crops that we can do, and Sarah put the oilseed rape thing right on the head earlier. So I think the industry is positive, the industry is looking. I picked up on Steve's point about the younger generation. They are wanting to explore, they want to be a bit more entrepreneurial, they want to be a bit more experimental, but there's going to need to be a lighter touch to the agri-policy in Scotland to support that and encourage it, and not maybe more of the same. So overall, I think supply chains are pretty good for the UK, but they're not without their frailties.
Okay. Peter, do you want to, because there's a few other people who want to come in, I wondered if you had a sort of general question which would allow them to come in as well. So.
Well, I mean, just a kind of a wrap-up thing. I mean, I totally agree with what's been said. I think we don't want to go down the lower standards route. We don't want to be selling on price, but there is an issue there. Eleanor hit the nail right in the head. You know, as an industry, we can become more productive, more efficient, and we can tackle these parts of the supply chain that we're not supplying at the moment. And I think this is where the younger generation see the opportunities, and do recognise that we need to become better at what we do, and what farmers all across UK or Scotland can do to prepare for Brexit is become better at what they do themselves. Get their own industry, get their own business into the best possible shape possible. And that's what they can do, because the wider political stuff is way beyond all of us, even us sitting here. So that's what, on a practical basis, the ordinary farmer out there can do, and can do right now.
Right. There's 4 people who want to come in, so it'll be very short points, and the order it's going to be is Sarah, followed by David, followed by Carmen, followed by Johnny, who gets the final say on this. So if I could ask your points to be as brief as possible. So, Sarah.
Just on some of the internal home market promotions, Quality Meat Scotland obviously does a lot of active marketing, and we've just came to the end of our Meat with Integrity campaign. I hope everyone around this table has seen, but that was a campaign that really looked to accentuate the qualities of the Scotch brands for our Scotch lamb, Scotch beef and specially selected pork. High welfare, produced, born, reared and slaughtered in Scotland, and that was aimed across the whole of the UK and in Scotland, and that was really trying to tie together some of the things that we've been discussing today about standards and about the provenance, and in terms of the consumer, Jamie, that label front, right and centre, you know, that's what it's all about. It's trying to tie all that together so our shoppers and our consumers have confidence in the food products that they are buying, and that they know the standards that they are buying into. So that's just a point there I want to say on marketing.
David.
Just wanted to Jamie's point as well. So you know, for many reasons, the bulk of the population, people cannot buy and cook good Scottish food. Maybe can't afford it. They're not educated. They don't have even a cooker to cook it. So I think it's really important to harness public procurement to provide food that is good. So good food to all. So, you know, food that's good for rural economy, good for the environment, and it's also good for people's health. And it can also help normalise good Scottish food within schools and hospitals and other public sector areas.
Okay, Carmen, briefly.
Going back to Peter, and I echo Archie and also James, talking about 100% self-sufficiency, it's a question. UK doesn't have a comparative advantage, particularly Scotland, when it comes to agriculture. We don't have it, and we will never be able actually to produce 100%. So we should focus on those products who actually brings us, which they are quality product and brings a premium. So we will never be. If we can produce everything we want in this country, but we will produce it at a cost. We can even produce whatever, you know, dragon fruits if we want under greenhouses. Going back to Jamie, at the same point as David, probably you bought the Scottish for various reasons, the Scottish product for your own reason, but probably also because you can afford to buy. And people, if we look at all the research which has been done when it comes to consumers, although as citizens they say we have very high ethical and moral values when it comes to animal welfare, and we were willing to pay a lot. That's not the case when people go in the shops. And if they have a choice, they will choose actually on price. Price should reflect quality, but does not always happen. So that's it.
Do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah. Two points, if I may. Just a word of caution on trade deals. We talked about standards in trade deals and agri-food and all the rest of it. Let's remind ourselves that we don't do free trade deals or agreements exclusively about food and food products. They're going to be part of a bigger free trade agreement. And history tells us that when it comes to food and agricultural issues, they're usually sticky. They're usually controversial. Countries have inherently, over years and decades, really dug in about protecting their own agriculture and own food sectors, and that, I think, will be a problem. You've always got to remember, whoever you're negotiating with on a free trade deal of any sort, they want to know what's in it for them. And, you know, at the end of the day, agriculture and food is important, very, very important, but it's kind of dwarfed by other things that might be in those trade deals. So I think we've got to be very, very careful about how we negotiate these things going forward, and it will not be easy. Well, it certainly won't. And then finally, on the promotion of Scottish agricultural products, I agree with lots of things that have been said. I think public procurement is something that we can do far more about on our own terms. You know, let's look closer to home. Labelling issues, promotion and education around food is clearly important. And finally, I agree with Carmen's point there that, you know, fundamentally, price is king in an awful lot of consumer choices being made, but we've got to try and overcome that. If it's purely on price, then we will get knocked out of the park far too often. So we've got to get that promotional work done. Public procurement is key, and I'm glad to see that the Scottish Government have recognised that in the programme for government.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to move on to the next theme, which is going to be led by the Deputy Convener, Maureen Watt. Maureen.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to move on to policy development, shared frameworks, funding and future wider policy. And I'd like to start by quoting the Institute of Government. They've stated that most of the 41 environment, agriculture and fisheries policy areas which have been devolved but which to date have been dealt with by the EU will require some kind of four-nation agreement after Brexit. In approaching these agreements, the UK Government will need to balance its own desire for a robust UK-wide statutory underpinning with the political and constitutional realities of devolution in the UK. So if I can lump all my questions together, do you have a sense of how intergovernmental machinery is working in relation to development of shared frameworks excuse me, on environment and agriculture? What involvement have your organisations had in shaping these frameworks? And what do you see the main challenges are in finalising these frameworks?
Right, looking around the room, Johnny.
Thank you. I think I've already touched on this particular issue, and therefore, by touching on it, you probably can guess that it still remains an outstanding concern. I still think we need significant amount of clarity about how frameworks will be governed once we're operating as a separate entity from the EU, because we have the EU institutions and the regulations that are transposed into the UK and Scots law. Over the last 2 or 3 years, clearly there's been an awful lot of interaction between the devolved administrations via the likes of the JMC, the Joint Ministerial Commission, and we would hope that as a consequence of that, some form of working relationship can come forward to avoid some of the concerns that I've already expressed about having different levels of standards or different operating standards across different parts of an internal UK market. I'm yet to be convinced that that's the case. We do try and engage with both the UK Government and the Scottish Government on this, but obviously an awful lot of this is still continuing behind closed doors. And I guess a lot of it will revolve around what happens on the 31st of October or another date thereafter. Clearly there's an awful lot of stuff that will be transferred as EU retained law and will just roll over for some time to come. But the governance of that EU retained law, I still think there are question marks around that. Will it be a UK function, or will it involve the devolved administrations? And I guess we're straying into constitutional matters somewhat, but in practical terms, these issues have to be addressed, because clearly there are differences in policy and policy approach, and quite rightly so, to reflect the different requirements of the devolved countries. And that's why agricultural policy is devolved. But we do need to operate within a UK-wide regulatory framework. And that sort of mismatch is still to be resolved, in my opinion.
Thank you, Johnny. Eleanor.
Echo Johnny's points. I think we both have the same concerns that whilst conversations began and we were all quite positive about the starting of these conversations, they did seem to stall somewhat and have only recently restarted. But what we need to know is that this time being lost as they continue to sort of disagree about powers and lack of detail doesn't help the industry. It doesn't help us move forward, and it certainly doesn't provide any amount of stability or certainty for our businesses. But we also need to know what it is they intend on sort of terms of Scottish ability to disagree or deviate from agreed common frameworks. But the very fact that we keep having discussions around whether or not governments will talk to each other or how much they agree with each other, it certainly doesn't bode well at the moment. But the conversations need to happen, need to make some progress, but it is all behind closed doors and we're not getting a great deal of feedback out of them.
Thank you, Eleanor. Archie.
Thank you. Where as Johnny mentions, there's obviously devolved responsibility for agriculture into Scotland, but actually at plant health level, it's a UK-wide thing. And I think there is quite a lot, and Johnny used the expression, behind-the-scenes stuff going on, which needs to come more to the front. I would suggest there are examples. I'll touch on one: soil health, very absolutely fundamental to long-term, around potato-assist nematodes. We're losing agricultural land for a higher value crop, which is our seed potato industry, to nematodes. There are solutions to it, and despite repeated efforts to get the Scottish Government Policy Unit to do something about it, they have been sitting on their hands. I've actually been invited to a meeting later, I think it's tomorrow actually, by SASA to see what's been going on behind the scenes, and I think that's something that the committee might want to request an update on periodically, I would suggest, because it is fundamental to the future of our agriculture and one of our more important export sectors, the availability of nematode-free land. Thank you.
Okay. Maureen, do you want to follow that up with a question? I'd like to try and bring James in, but I wondered if, and one or two others.
Well, I think I'd just like to make a comment that I'm not sure these conversations are taking place because there's no kind of lead on them from the UK government, although there's willingness to talk at GMC. If you talk to our negotiators there, they'll just say they're tearing their hair out because UK government doesn't really know what it's doing. But also, Johnny, I think you might be contradicting yourself because, all throughout this conversation this morning, we've talked about the provenance of Scottish food and the need to keep that provenance to get that market edge. But anything that you hear coming out of the UK government would be that they're more likely to go to the US model than the EU model, whereas I would have thought that we want to keep the standards that we've already had at the EU level. So if there's diversity within the UK, it won't be because Scotland is wanting to change from high levels of provenance and food standards and things. It'll be because another of the nations wants to move.
Johnny, do you want to come back on that?
Because, I don't think I've contradicted myself in the slightest. Our concern is that we have two fundamental markets that we have to operate in. The domestic UK internal market, which is what we've already discussed, is significantly important to Scottish agriculture. And then whatever other opportunities there are beyond the UK. And, we must value our standards, we must safeguard our standards, and we cannot afford ourselves to be undercut in any way. We do start to lose the USP that James has referred to. And that's why I have concern about, and that's what hopefully I express my concern about, the fact that there is no apparent agreement at a UK level across the devolved administrations about how standards will be governed. And as a stakeholder rather than government, that gives me significant concerns, because our industry is under threat by those potentials that you've identified. But it's an issue that we have to take up with the UK government, but equally we have to ensure that the Scottish government are also taking up that challenge as well. And where I sit, I'm not getting much from either government.
Speak to Jeff Ogo about the meeting they had last week. He'll tell you what it's like.
I'm sure that's...
I'd just make an observation. I think it's quite interesting when the committee looked at the forestry bill and how the forestry responsibilities would be split up between various parts of the UK. It seemed to work pretty well when there was a will to sort that, and different parts of the UK took on different responsibilities. Is that what you're suggesting, Johnny, or are you suggesting a more centralised control?
I still view that we needed, our view would be you need something independent of government to operate as if you like, the auditor of standards, the enforcer of standards. And we do that in many other respects. And I think that needs to be applied at the UK level to ensure that we are operating to the same rules on the same playing field.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to delivery of agricultural policy, that's a different matter, because that's where you do need to have devolved flexibility to afford the different agricultures of the UK the right opportunity to deliver support in the required ways.
Stephen, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, just picking up on Johnny's point there. I mean, 2.5 years ago, we had a seminar on Brexit, and I think at that I mentioned that the EU infrastructure needs to be replicated somehow within an oversight body to actually govern and come up with rules, etc. And we're still no closer. We have no idea what's coming down the track in terms of who is going to have oversight in terms of pesticides, plant protection products, what is permissible to be used in agriculture, all of those kind of things that are fundamental to the operation of UK agriculture. And as Johnny says, what the policy level in terms of the levers and the funding that goes down to farmers is a slightly different argument or discussion. Although we still need to play within a certain set of rules, a framework, and have the flexibility to deliver much more locally, which of course is what the EU are trying to do just now. And we mustn't forget in terms of policy that they're already evolving and are evolving their CAP, and we shouldn't lose sight of that.
Okay, I think then what we're going to do is move on to the next theme, which is the final theme, which will be led by Mike Rumbles. Mike.
Thanks very much, Convener. I want to focus on developing future policy for farming and food production in Scotland. So we're looking to the future. Some 8 months ago in the Scottish Parliament here, we passed a motion which said calls on the Scottish Government to convene a group consisting of producer, consumer and environmental organisations to inform and recommend a new bespoke policy on farming and food production for Scotland. Now, 4 representatives here this afternoon, 4 of our guests, have organisations that are on the committee that was formed by the Scottish Government. And really, if I could start off by asking, how are we getting on? It was 8 months ago that the Parliament called for this, and it has been set up. How are we doing?
So who'd like to start on that? Who would you like to start on that, Mike?
Oh, I'd like Johnny to have a go first.
Johnny.
Well, I'll certainly then ask the convener to ask Sarah to speak, because she actually sits on the group. I don't, but we do have...
We should go to Sarah to start with. Sarah,
as long as you come back to me, convener.
That's called dodging the thing. You could well be a good politician. Sarah.
So it was just as an update. So the group was formally announced at the Royal Highland Show this year. So I sit on that along with others, as you said, representatives in this organisation. So we had our first meeting about a month ago. We've got another meeting next week. And the plan is to publish a report at next year's Royal Highland Show. So I think in terms of that amendment, the work is well underway with that. In the programme for government, we saw the publication of the Rural Payments Bill, which is to take us through until 2024, as I understand it, and then the new agricultural policy that this group is currently looking at will be formulated from the discussions from the amendment group. So that's my understanding of the direction of travel and timescales, and the NCRA work, which I was also a member of alongside Archie and others here, and the Ag Champions work are all building into this final. So it's, yeah, that's state of play.
Johnny.
Sarah said very much what I would say by way of introduction to Mike Rumble's point about where's that process going, and it's started, but it's still got obviously a long way to go. I think the more important reference points are the Scottish Government's stability and simplicity agenda, which has clearly mapped out a process from now to 2024, as Sarah's just referred, whereby in the programme for government you've got a rural payments bill going to come forward that will do the stabilisation bit, which will basically means the wheels won't come off in terms of making payments. But thereafter, we're still actually waiting for something that will enable Scottish ministers to make Scottish decisions about Scottish agricultural policy, to implement some of the things that Sarah and the rest of the group will, I hope, recommend. My biggest concern, and I think our biggest concern, is about timescales. 2024, we're almost in 2020. 2024 is another 4 years down the line. The big date in my mind, and you might think I'm crackers for saying this, is 2030. And you say, why is he on about 2030? Well, two things. I'm going to look at James over there. Ambition 2030 says we're going to grow Scotland's food and drink sector from 14.5 billion to 30 billion in that time frame. The other one, which hasn't been mentioned at all yet today, which is massively challenging for the agricultural sector, is climate change. And we've now got legislation passed in this Parliament that says that Scotland will meet climate change targets of net zero by 2045. But it also says in there it will have met a 70% reductions target by 2030. Now, 2030 is a decade away. And if you look back over the last decade, how much has Scottish agriculture changed? I would say not enough in any direction. So we've got a decade to make significant changes in everything we do. And they're both equally challenging. And arguably, they might be contradictory because they might pull us into a more productive, more driven area, or they might be pulling us away from production and more into how we manage our land in the sake of climate change. We cannot achieve both of those as an industry under the current regimes in which we operate in terms of the CAP. We need new tools in the toolbox, and that's why we need this new policy group to come forward with a new approach to how you enable Scottish agriculture to deliver on the agenda that it's now being asked to undertake. I think we can do it, but it's going to be about shifting payments absolutely away from an area-based system and more to an action-based system that drives productivity, drives innovation, drives resource efficiency, creates resilience and all the other things we've talked about. But if we sit on our hands till 2024, I don't think we're going to give ourselves a chance to get to 2030 and have delivered what we want to deliver at all. So I think there's an industry out there ready and willing, as long as it's given the tools to get on with the job. We cannot ask the industry to deliver on what Scotland requires and then not give it the tools to do so.
Okay, I'm going to bring in Eleanor because you published a document to your organisation which is looking at 2050, not 2030. And once I've done that, I'm going to bring Jamie in. Eleanor.
Yeah, on Monday, actually, we launched our Route 2050, which the committee have all got a copy for, and it's all available on our website. But that details, it's not just the sort of immediate short-term plan, it is a long-term vision for where we think we can go and how we might get there. It's a starting point. It is not the final document. But the idea is that we will build on this and have more detail as to what individual policy might be needed. When we completely agree, there are key activities detailed in the programme for government which are promising provided they are delivered, and they are of course linked in with the climate change, and we fed into the, or Sarah Jane, our Executive Director, fed into the Climate Emergency Response Group that a lot of those points came from, and we're very grateful that we've been able to feed into these sorts of things. It's clear that agriculture can't just be viewed on its own. We have to look at the whole rural economy, but also the climate aspects, the environmental, the biodiversity. We've got sustainable development goals and a forestry strategy. There's so much stuff that needs to be considered as we move forward, but we can't wait to start moving forward. We know that things need to start changing. We know we need to look more at efficiency and productivity, and that there are policy changes that can be made now before we reach the end of the transition period. But we also need to know what we will be working towards at the end of this transition period. Stability and Simplicity is a great document. What we need is clarity on what lies beyond that and the direction of travel. The industry is willing and it's nearly ready. We need activity.
Okay. Jamie Green, you wanted to say something?
Yes, thanks, Convener. It's just following on from what's been said, and I commend the 2050 document. It was an interesting read. I noticed that your Chief Executive Director used the phrase that you were tied into the CAP and now you were presented with an opportunity to move forward. And I think building on that theme, what I think is entirely unclear is what the direction of travel is for subsidies and what is being subsidised and what farmers are being subsidised to do in future, and that's both at a UK level and indeed in Scotland as well. And when we've asked the Cabinet Secretary for the rural economy in this room what the direction of travel is on policy, we often get the answer, well, you know, I haven't been told how much money we're going to have to play with in order to develop that policy, and others have argued, well, surely you're developing the policy that will then say how much money you need to implement that policy. So I wonder if the panel had views on or any ideas of where they would like to see the direction of travel for the future of subsidies for farmers, where they have any particular views on what a better model might look like post-CAP, and if it presents an opportunity at all.
I'm going to bring David in, and then I'm going to come to you, Colin. So I'd like to bring David in on that point, and then I'll come to you, Colin.
Yes, I'm going to pick up on something that Johnny said and also what Jamie said. So, yeah, absolutely, the climate emergency has been declared. We have very little time to respond to it. And Scotland's agriculture is responsible for a significant proportion of our greenhouse gas emissions. So the status quo is absolutely not an option. Something has to change, and has to change quickly. And the First Minister also said that tackling biodiversity loss is as important as the challenge on climate change, so we mustn't lose sight of that. And picking up on the Agricultural Champions document, they said that the policies must be guided by real evidence about what the public values. And the Scottish Parliament ran a citizens' jury on land management and the natural environment, and there was also citizens' forums and attitudes to agriculture, environment and rural priorities. And in these, at the end of it, after deliberation, the majority, well, the largest proportion of people wanted payments to be made that was for the benefit of the environment. So,
Roman.
Thank you. I was just trying to see whom I'm echo, because I thought it was something which I want to come back to. My point, looking at what's going on from as an economist, is that any policy, we have to think for what is that policy, so what are the objectives which we are trying actually to achieve. Yes, somebody said about policy measures. So in order to have policy measure, you need first to define the policy objective very clear. So which I don't think for the moment they are coming out of any of the countries. So for what, how they will be implemented, and how much money actually will be allocated for, and for whom will be actually allocated. And I'm not sure that's really, things which have been clear. And I don't understand, what is the policy objective which we are trying to achieve. If you have too many, then you will need a lot of measures and things will actually get complicated. I also think that in all the discussion which so far, it is missing the balance between food and environment. I think it's a lot of pressure which comes from from the NGOs in terms of environment and climate change. I'm not against, but I'm just thinking that somehow we missed the balance is very much on that side, and we forgot about that agriculture is actually producing food. And people are eating beef rather than cows, you know, sitting out nicely in the field and making us happy looking when we go and walk in the fields. So that's the other point. Subsidies, the trouble for subsidies, as an agriculture economist, I am not a supporter of subsidies. But if there are subsidies, okay, let's think to whom do actually we give it and why we are giving them. Because so far from the CAP point of view, we know that those who were large farms and they have a lot of land, they benefited most. So those who were smaller never really, you know, got the benefits. So the question about subsidies, probably as an agriculture economist, I would like to think that we would like to change the farmers' minds and not only farmers, everybody about thinking about, you know, subsidies, public subsidies. So we need to think how we can work together to make an efficient system. And then we talk about efficiency within the Scottish industry. How can we actually make the farming industry more efficient and more productive in Scotland when you have 60% of your farms who are making a loss without subsidies? So that's my
food for thought, maybe. Colin.
What I took from the Route 2050 document, the Step for Change document from the NFU, the work of Scottish Environment Link, and just about everybody around this table, is that there's a desperate need for an awful lot more detail on the future direction, and actually the pace of change needs to be sped up considerably. But we've had parliamentary motion 8 months ago and one meeting of a group set up effectively to give that level of detail and direction to the government. So forgive me if I'm a bit nervous that, frankly, we're not quite meeting what people around this table are actually demanding in terms of that detail and change. So what physically needs to happen to deliver what just about every stakeholder is telling politicians across Scotland needs to happen, but what is the blockage to making that happen, and what fundamentally needs to change and change quickly to make it happen?
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to bring in Archie and then James, and then Mike. I'll bring you back in and to allow a few more questions at the end. So, Archie.
Thanks, Convener. To try and address some issues around Mike's question, I would say there is, and David touched on it, there are a wealth of good bits of work that's been done, Agri-Champions, NCRA, Citizens Forum, land use, etc. And it's a question of bringing those together, which I guess the new committee is remit to do. But I notice there's some gaps in their complexion around vegetable production, for example, something that we could do more of in Scotland, not only to be self-sufficient, but also add value and export. So I would hope that will not be lost in that element of their work. I would pick up on David around farm emissions. One of the things that we as an Agri-Champions group felt quite strongly about was that the way in which emissions are currently measured does not reflect the positive benefit that a green and verdant land that is Scotland delivers back, and which our farmers do extremely well. And I think there needs to be a bit more scientific thought and more a review of what is measured and how it is assessed relative to emissions. We know from Mrs. Cunningham's ambition to 2050 that we're looking to go to zero emissions, and that will be challenging in Scotland. But we are a green country, so actually, if we get the measurement bit right, we can probably achieve a more balanced result for in the interests of our society and our farming community. And I think that's enough from me. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Peter Chapman appealed a bit earlier to think about opportunity. Rightly, this is it. In my view, this is the opportunity out of Brexit to create a new, different type of agriculture and rural support framework fit for Scotland. And I think as much ability of Scotland to develop the policy that's right for Scotland and the powers here to do that, I think would be hugely beneficial based on the history of how policies developed so far. I think, Johnny quite rightly raises the point, we're trying to grow the food and drink industry in a climate emergency. Do these contradict each other? Some would say they do. I've never seen a better policy fit ever between responding to a climate emergency and growing a farming, food and drink industry in Scotland. As the world debates how we produce food sustainably, particularly protein and red meat, which has had some criticism recently, this is the place potentially to do it. And the advantage of the agricultural support framework at the moment is a massive lever on behaviour on farm and through the supply chain. What behaviour do we want to see on farm? And it's about striving for improvement and greater productivity and adoption of technology and involvement in cooperation. But that support framework also supports the rest of the supply chain. Large grants we hand out to manufacturers across Scotland. What kind of businesses do we want to support there? They should be about UK sales and about international. They should have a collaborative relationship with their producer group with transparent contracts and open discussions. And building a support policy around that, which is about sustainable food production and creating that behaviour on farm, I think could transform things. Because we know that the profitability issues we see on farm, never has, using an average profitability figure been more unrepresentative of agriculture in Scotland. The gap between our top performers and bottom performers, a few other sectors would tolerate, and there's a huge opportunity to change that, I think, over the coming years. And we've got some time to be able to do that now.
Okay. Mike, do you want to come back and sort of...
I'm actually, if I can just say that this is over the developing the future of policy and getting these groups together. It's something that I've been very keen to try and help promote. And it might seem strange from an opposition MSP, but I congratulate the Scottish Government for getting there. And I was a little bit disappointed and worried that we weren't actually going to make much progress with it. It seemed to be rather slow, but I'm very heartened from particularly Sarah's contribution, saying that they aim to, I think, get the recommendations out by the Royal Highland Show next year. So that actually, and the comments that Johnny has made about, it's actually important to get moving on this, because although we've got to 2024, which might sound, and I was very heartened to hear him say this, that might sound as though we've got time. Actually, we haven't got a great deal of time, and I would urge it's really, for my comments are really particularly to the 4 organisations out of the 8 that are represented here who are represented on this new group, actually to work together. If we can get the food producers, the consumer organisations and the environmental organisations to come up with a positive new way forward by next summer, it will be to Scotland's tremendous advantage. And I think that is the key to moving, as Johnny said, and I hope that they come up with something that will move us from perhaps area to action. And action is the word I would like to see. So it's really more of a comment and an urging the 4 particular organisations to work closely together. That way they can hear that.
Okay. Stephen, I'm going to bring you in now.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think a lot of people have raised an awful lot of very good points here. We are needing to express what our outcomes are in terms of policy. We never really have had to. They're pretty wishy-washy grand statements that have come out of Europe based on the 1957 the CAP starting point. We haven't really taken the chance to actually say what we're after. We're now in a situation where climate's obviously vital. Climate change, we are talking about a biodiversity crisis that nobody really is raising above the parapet, and also clean and healthy food production. So we need to be clear what our policy objectives are. Not all farms will be able to deliver, or crofts will be able to deliver to each of these things, but we have to have flexibility in our approach, which enables the industry to actually, and local businesses to actually adopt and use the support mechanisms. I don't like the word subsidy because it's technically we're contracting farmers, and we should look at it going forward. We're contracting farmers, foresters, crofters, land managers to actually deliver a suite of different things for the general public. We have to understand what the market failure is, because the rationale for any support is based on market failure. So unless there is market failure, we need to actually, we shouldn't really be intervening. I think in the long term, the retailers are going to grasp on climate change. They're going to force I would think in the next few years, they will be starting to look at the carbon footprint of the farmers. I sit in the Agriculture 1.5 panel, which was convened by Nourish Scotland and NFUS. And within that, we are discussing this aspect of measurement. So coming back to the point that was made earlier, that agriculture in all of these inventories, agriculture is one of these things that emits and never sequesters, because forestry, if you do woodland on your farm, then it goes into the forestry sector. If you do renewable energy on your farm, then it goes into the energy sector. You know, the fact that peatland isn't included in the inventory. There's a whole host of things. So looking at it in totality rather than actually in subsections in those senses is what that panel's trying to do. But we've got a God-given right here to change the path dependency that we've had on CAP. And whether or not we stay in Europe or go out of Europe, we need to change our policy. And the CAP is evolving to allow people to change their policies. And we need to grasp that.
Thank you, Stephen. Johnny.
I would just echo what has just been said in the last few minutes. You know, Brexit, whether you agree with it, disagree with it, hate it, loathe it, whatever, it provides a catalyst for change, and change is exactly what this industry needs. Regardless of the political upheaval of the last 3 years, I would say 10, 15 years ago, we needed some sort of seismic shift in how we do things, because we've trundled through various iterations of the CAP, as Stephen's just articulated. We've ended up with a system whereby 90+% of our support payments are area-based, and they do not reflect anything in terms of particular outcomes or objectives, as Carmen refers to, and they don't even support incomes, which is probably the primary function in the first place. So it is the time for change. The question was also asked by Jamie, I think it was, about what ideas and proposals are out there. I think there are a lot. Our own Steps for Change, which has been kicking around for 18 months now, and we're developing the next phase of that, gives a clear pathway to how we might develop and deliver support in the future, which goes back to James's point about the fact that your food production and adding value is not mutually exclusive to caring and managing the environment, particularly in a climate change context. The two things should be viewed as one, because at the end of the day, it's about driving productivity, not production, and it's about driving innovation and efficiency. And that's something that the CAP has significantly failed to do. And here we have an opportunity. I think somebody mentioned opportunity. I think, Peter, it was earlier on. Well, here is an opportunity, but if we sit and twiddle our thumbs and don't grasp it, and I think in 10 years' time we'll be turning around saying, we haven't actually moved anywhere.
Okay, so Sarah, just before we come to you, the message seems to be we need to change the direction that farming's heading in to hit all the targets that the government and people want us to achieve. So you get the chance to close on this particular theme.
So, just echoing what's been said, I suppose the thought behind the stability and simplicity in farming, so I worked as a consultant before I came into the role that I'm in, cash is king. And what our current system does is it enables cash to come into farmers' bank accounts at times where it can then be utilised in other areas of the business. So, and it doesn't often stay there for long, it'll go out into other parts of the industry. So having that stability when there are other areas of uncertainty, trade, regulation, etc., does give that confidence piece that we started this morning speaking about. So that is my understanding, and actually I think that is a positive thing, especially for our livestock producers who work in longer term farming cycles. But I do accept there is a huge opportunity here to fundamentally change how we do things, and that has absolutely got to be grasped. And it absolutely echoed James Withers' comments. This is the biggest opportunity we have, and absolutely we talk about win-wins, things that are good for the environment, good for combating climate change, and are good for productivity as well. So there's an opportunity there that we're absolutely as a group determined to grasp, but also farmers on the ground. I'm a hill farmer as well. The stability of knowing that there's going to be a payment coming to us is very, very welcome.
Thank you. And that brings us to a logical conclusion to this session. I'd like to thank, on behalf of the committee, all those people who've come in and spoken this morning. I'd also like to apologise if I didn't get them in at the right moment and they didn't get an opportunity to say everything that they wanted to say. But it's been incredibly useful for us, and as a committee we have the Cabinet Secretary coming in the near future, and this will help inform our decision. So thank you very much for your time and all the effort you put into it, and that concludes this morning's meeting. Thank you.